Hello, today we're delighted to have a guest, Monique Lewis, who is actually speaking to us from France, Paris, France. And she is a graduate of the Wilkes MA program, MFA program, and she has gone on to start an organization called At the Inkwell. Welcome, Monique.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us about At the Inkwell, Monique. What do you do, and how does it work?
Yes. So At the Inkwell is an organization that I created to support published authors, both up and coming as well as more well-known authors as well too. And I initially started it as doing interviews of the writers and talking to them about their new releases to help promote their writing and promote their books. And I created At the Inkwell out of a love of trying to get acquainted with new writers and trying to make sure that readers can discover new writers, particularly within their own communities. And as it becomes more and more crowded of the market in terms of the competition and promoting your book, I think that every avenue possible is important for writers. And I wanted to be one of those avenues. And it really was born out of my internship that I created for myself to get my during my part of my MFA at Wilkes University. And so I was teaching writing workshops. And then at the end of the workshop period, I wanted my students to read their work. And so they read their work at KGB Bar. And I loved doing those readings so much that I wanted it to continue. And I was doing this at the same time that I was writing interviews for the authors. And then I decided, okay, maybe I can make this something that will continue on and combine all of these different aspects that help writers get noticed in their communities. So it evolved from interviews to doing the readings. And then from there, also book reviews. So I found freelancers to write the book reviews, and I just loved it and helping the writers. So I started it in New York, and then from there, I expanded it to San Francisco, and then to Seattle and Denver and London. And I found local curators and helped train them and help them model the reading series.
Wow. And
Yeah.
so, what are the challenges that you faced when you? I'm smiling because the KGB bar, which I've been to this series that you've curated there, and it's a smoky little place, but it has a wonderful history and traditions. How did you, frankly, get them to get involved with these kinds of locations? What were the challenges that you faced?
The first challenge is that nobody knew who I was. And that was the first obstacle, particularly for KGB Bar. And so the first time I went to KGB Bar, it was to hear another writer, Kaylee Jones. And so I loved the location. And at that time, I didn't have At the Inkwell going. I was doing the readings for the students who I taught for beginners fiction. And so I asked the owner if I could host a reading there. And he said to me, "I don't know you, and I have to make so much X amount of money on the bar for drinks." And I pitched him a proposal. I told him who I was, and quite frankly, he trusted me because I was a student of Kaylee. So he said to me, "Well, I know Kaylee, and Kaylee does really well here. So if you know her, okay, I'll give you a shot." So I made sure that I marketed it really well and made sure that the room was packed. And then after that, I had a door in. I had my foot in the door, and I continued to do the readings. And so because of that, that's how it got started. And then I would sit down and explain whenever I expanded to other locations, I would explain to them how I got started, talk to the owners what I've done, show them the type of writers that I brought in, show them how many people would come to these events and what was my desire and why I thought it was important. And so it was really just selling them on the idea.
And in a sense, Monique, it's kind of like you're acting like a publisher. I mean, this is a different venue, not print publishing, but you're selecting. You know,
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot more people want to read than you can accommodate. That's the, you know, that's the way the business works. How do you make those choices?
How do we curate the writers that we just think is going
Yeah,
to be
I mean,
good?
how do you pick them, and how do you
Mm-hmm.
deal with that?
Yes. So initially it started with the writers whose work I knew already. And I've been to their readings. I saw how well they could deliver, because that's also the challenge too, is someone could be a really great writer, but then they could have stage fright and may not deliver on how great their writing is. And so it's a different experience. And so I want to make sure that it's a great experience for both the writer and the reader, the people who are there, the potential readers. So I would go and listen to these writers to see if they were good as well as their writing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that's how I got started. And then it was other writers coming to me and saying, I would love to be part of the series. And so I would give them a chance as well. And even if I didn't know their writing, but I hadn't heard them read, but I wanted them to have that opportunity. And so it blossomed from there as well. And then from other writers, pitching writers to me, and who had read from my series, and then they would pitch other writers and they would tell them, oh, I think this person would be great for you for the series as well.
Right, right, right. You mentioned, of course, and it's very true, and it's perfectly natural that a person who's a great writer isn't necessarily going to be a great performer of their own writing, and they're two completely different skills. What advice would you have? I mean, you've listened to so many readings now. You can, you know, tell what would you tell a person who is going to apply for, or, you know, submit work to your series? Say, how can they be better?
Yes. When it comes to reading for the series.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Um, I would say that I think the thing that people do that is damaging to their performance is they are reading people's expressions.
Hmm.
And I can tell that when they're reading, and I could see on their facial expression that they're paying attention to the audience's facial expression, and then it starts to impact their reading. And so I've actually told some writers who were very nervous, I would say, don't look at people's expressions in their faces, because what you think you're reading is not what you think their expressions mean is not what it is. Sometimes we all make different and weird facial expressions when we're listening to writers. And so they would get nervous and think that, oh, the people don't like my writing because they're reading their expressions, the audience expressions. So I would tell them, don't look at their facial expressions, look at the top of their heads. And that's a technique that I was given when I used to do dance many years ago. And is like, don't look at the audience faces, look at the top of their heads, because it's going to impact your performance, because you're going to make a wrong assumption about whether or not they like what you're doing. And so because I've had some writers who didn't do well in the series when it came to performing, because I think it's because they were so nervous. Or what are the readers in the audience thinking of my writing? And so I've given people a chance who I've never, again, like I said, I've never seen them perform before, and they've done excellent. And then other people who've had the fright. So I would just say that I've never said no to somebody that I've never seen perform. So there isn't any kind of what's the word I'm looking for? I'm not just going to automatically rule them out because I haven't seen them perform. It's more about, are you confident in your writing? Do you have that eagerness to share your work? Do you have that eagerness to meet other readers, meet other writers, and connect them to your writing? And if I don't see that drive or that energy, then it would turn me off.
Right, Right.
Yeah.
And now you've expanded. You started, in New York City at KGB.
Mm.
How did that go? What made you say, "Hey, I want to do this in other cities"?
Yeah. So just one thing, we're not at KGB anymore. We had relocated to Brooklyn, and now because of COVID, our readings are on a halt for now, and we're looking at doing virtual readings. But the way that it expanded, I was inspired by another series, and it's not for published writers, but it's called The Moth.
Hmm.
And it's a storytelling series where people from the audience tell a story spontaneously. And there's a theme, and they pick the theme, and if they're chosen out of a box, their name is chosen out of a hat, and they come up and they tell a story based on the theme of that night. Well, this series called The Moth is nationwide in the US and also has some locations international. And I love that format, that they had expanded their brand of storytelling in so many markets. And I didn't know of any reading series at the time that was like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was for people just from the public would come and tell stories. And I thought, well, I want to do that with writers who and have the brand in different markets and create a circuit for writers if they wanted to. And so they could read for me in New York, and they could read for me in San Francisco and here and there. And I've had writers do that. You've done that.
Yeah.
And so I thought, why isn't that accessible to writers? So that I looked at San Francisco because San Francisco is also the literary hub of the West Coast to New York. And so that's how I singled out the markets. Where are the markets that have a huge literary community? And so that was the next one, San Francisco. And I put a call out to my network of writers saying, I'm looking to expand here. And I started at the Inkwell in New York in 2013. And then I expanded it 2 years later to San Francisco in 2015. And there was a writer who I was connected to there. She loved my idea. We had a call. I told her about what I wanted to do, and she was interested and said she'd like to be the curator. And so I told her, so I launched a series. I launched the series in San Francisco with a test reading. So I found writers there, and I started putting out the call and saying, I want to do a poetry reading. And then I also reached out to the SF Gate, which is a local newspaper there. And then so they did an article on At the Inkwell. And so I did everything I could to drum up interest and told them how I was bringing it from New York to San Francisco and setting up there. And then the reading went really well. And the woman who was interested in doing the curating, she came and she loved it. And then she started the series. And she was a writer herself. And I found that people who are also writers themselves, they're already self-motivated and very passionate about the community, that they will do really well leading the series. So I guided her and coached her. And I did the same thing by identifying other large literary hub communities and setting up curators there.
And then you did the same thing in Denver, and then was Denver the next, and you were living in Denver, as I recall.
I moved back home in 2015. And so the same year that I launched San Francisco, that year I moved back to Denver. And so I continued to focus on, and I set up a curator before I left in New York to take my place. And then I had the curator in San Francisco. So then I was at home in Denver. And then in 2016, I launched Seattle because I had a book reviewer who was reviewing poetry books for me. And then I told him I was interested in Seattle. And then he said he would like to do the curating in Seattle. So then I went out to Seattle. I did the same thing that I did in San Francisco, set up the reading there, found a place. He helped find a place. We worked together to find a venue. And so San Francisco, I forgot to tell you, was Alley Cat Books is where we did our series there. And then Vermilion Art Gallery and Bar in Seattle. So we launched Seattle in February 2016. And then the second following month after, March 2016, I launched Denver. And then that same year, I launched in London in 2016 in July. And I did the same way that I went about finding the curators. And in this case, the curators, they themselves found the venue in London. So then I went out to London in July 2016, and then we launched the series there. So in 1 year, I launched 3 markets. And it was Seattle, Denver, and London in 1 year in 2016. And then I also forgot to mention Richmond, because then I had another writer who was a book reviewer, and he was interested in setting up. He approached me and wanted to do a series in Richmond, Virginia. And so that started, I believe Richmond started a little later that year. Sorry, it was 4 cities in 1 year. So Richmond also started later that year, towards the end of the year. And that one was tied to workshops. So we found a venue for creative artists in the community. And so he would also teach writing workshops, and then found other writers that wanted to teach a writing workshop. So we combined it, and it was focused on poetry. So it was a poetry workshop, and then after the workshop would be the reading. So, and then for different purposes, because all these curators, they're doing it on a volunteer basis. At the Inkwell isn't making any money. I could have, if I wanted to, try to turn it into a business, but that's not where my heart was in my mind. And that would have went a whole nother route if I wanted, for me personally, to try to make money out of it, and not the route I wanted it to go. And I wanted it to stay focused on local writers and helping to support the writers, because at the end of these series, these writers would sell their books to the audience. And so I wanted it to focus solely on supporting the writers. So I was, for whatever different purposes and reasons, sometimes the curators, they had other things change in their personal lives, so then they couldn't continue curating. And then, so now we just have 3 markets: New York, Denver, and San Francisco.
Wow.
So.
You know, and that leads me to the amazing thing, aside from all the outreach, is clearly this speaks to a hunger that writers have, and that you have been the catalyst to feed, a hunger to communicate and to network and to create community without an economic reward right away. What happens after the readings, Monique? How does this community, this international network, if you will, sustain?
Yes. So after the readings, what's really amazing to me is that when these writers feel that they had a great experience, is that then they go and tell other writers to get involved in At the Inkwell. And it's opening other doors, and they continue to help other writers. That's what I love, is that they want to help other writers too. And then I discover new writers, and it's just that the circle, it never ends. And so I think that's what's great, is that it keeps going.
Yes, it's a widening, as Yeats would say, a widening gyre. What about France, Monique? Are you? You've been there now for almost 2 years, did you say?
Yes.
And what is your literary connection there? And is there going to be an At the Inkwell in Paris?
Yes, I know. Many people have asked me this for a long time. And, since I've arrived here, I had to take a full year to integrate and set myself up. And that came along with this other set of distractions that I couldn't focus on establishing At the Inkwell. And so now that I've been here for 2 years, as you said, almost 2 years, once we come through this hurdle of COVID, I do want to go back to setting up a reading series here, because there are many, many, many Americans here too. And I think that they would love to come to the readings, and people from different cultures, they would love to come to these readings. And I've been to some of the readings at the Shakespeare bookshop, and people, and I want to emulate that as well. But I want to emulate it for the writers that are up and coming. And I think that that's always a market that isn't tapped into much. And I love the writers that we know, but I want to know the writers that we don't know. And I know that there are those writers here in Paris. So as soon as we are past COVID, that is my dream, is to set up a Paris at the Inkwell.
And I'm curious too, the whole Zoom reading thing, what you mentioned earlier about trying to not be intimidated by the presence of others. And I know how that feels. I always think that, the more people in the room, my IQ drops, because it's just the energy from coming up. It can be enlivening, but it can also be intimidating. And with Zoom, it's a complete, I've done a few readings in this venue, and it's completely different because you're kind of whispering. You don't have to, you feel like you're looking at people, but once again, you're really only looking at boxes. And it's a very interesting, different kind of experience. And I'm wondering, is this going to be something that you foresee as part of the continuing networking of writers, or do you think that this is just a stopgap while we're under quarantine?
I think that being in person, nothing can fully replace that intimacy that you get between the writer and the reader. When they hear the writer reading their books, I think that people will still want to go back to that. Plus, I'm also thinking about how difficult it is to go and get that reader to buy your book after you've done a virtual reading. Because when we're there in person, and as a buyer, I'm there, I see your book, okay, I'm going to buy the book.
Right.
And that's the part that it won't replace it to the same extent. I still can send you the link to buy my book. I can give you a code, an offer code, but then it's a higher hurdle to get someone to click on that link, because we think, oh, I have it, I can go back to it later, I can think of it. And there's a different relationship between you and the screen versus me and the writer there in person and seeing their book after I've had a wonderful listening experience and being drawn into the story, and I'm more apt to buy the book right there and then.
Sure. And plus, you can't get an autograph on Zoom.
No, you can't get an autograph. No. And so, I will say, I'll give you an example. A couple of weeks ago, there's an art gallery near my apartment, and I was walking by, and I went inside the gallery, and I saw that the photographer had a book along with poetry that it was written to his photos. I love projects like that, where he had a writer who wrote poetry for his photos. And so then I asked the gallery owner about buying the book, and he says, "Oh, actually, the writer is coming." And it was sorry, not the writer, it was the photographer. The photographer is coming, and you can get it signed by him. And I said, "Oh, that's great." And so I waited for him to come and sign it for me. And that I love that feeling of having the writer sign the book. So like you said, you can't replace that. Mm-hmm. And I waited and waited. So you're never going to replace that person-to-person contact.
Let me ask you one last question, Monique, and that is, how has At the Inkwell impacted your own work, your own writing?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that is a good question. The way it's impacted my writing is when I've come across writers in the series that stayed with me, and I was so enamored with their writing style and their technique and how they develop certain characters in a very complex way. And then I read their book and I read it, and I will go back and reread certain passages to help influence me. And so if I hadn't been exposed in this way to all these writers, I don't think that I would have seen my writing in a different way. So it's more of having that close access that I didn't have before, if that makes sense. It's different when I'm buying books randomly and I'm reading the books, but because I was close to these writers in that way of constantly picking writers and then hearing their words and then reading their words on the page in a very different eye than when I was a casual reader. Yeah.
Wow. That sounds so much like the publishing experience too. It's, you
Mm-hmm.
have these relationships. I tell people, your mother, your spouse, all these other people will eventually get sick of hearing you talk about your work, but your publisher never will. In some ways, that intimate experience with writers it casts a completely different light on your own work. So
It does.
thank you so much, Monique Lewis, international event organizer and writer. And we wish you the best of luck. Merci beaucoup.
Merci. Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure.